Okay, so if you've had a chance to listen to last night's recording, you realize that it was basically just a setup for today. So the Tuesday class is benefiting from Monday night setup. But at this point, I'm not going to go back and review everything we did last night. There's too much material to cover today. In fact, I'll have to probably go chipmunk speed to get everything in. And there's lots of scripture reading. So there's probably some things you want to go back and you want to reread those. Or if you haven't had a chance to read those passages from the Torah portion, you'll definitely want to go back and reread those because we're just barely scratching the surface between what the Torah portion is instructing us about idolatry, those who incite to idolatry, and cities who have been given over to idolatry. And whether those cities can be salvaged or not, and how they are salvaged, because it's going to inform the way that we look at the book of Revelation again. So let me share the screen with you. Of course, our Torah portion is re'eh, which means see. And we're going, again, our learning this week on the Torah portion is dedicated to the memory of Starla Akers' parents. Starla is one of our students. She's also an excellent teacher herself. Her parents passed away. And like I told last night's class, if you read the obituary, you'll realize, this is a great testimony. This wasn't a funeral. This was a great proclamation of their faith in Yeshua. And so we want to dedicate our learning today to their memory. And may all of us have an obituary that reads like that one. It was incredible. So we're going to skip forward here. We did some defining of charity last night, the difference between tzedakah and mishpat, or we might say righteousness and charity, and judgment. And the problem is that the translators are not consistent when they translate these words into English, so it can be very confusing. It's worth going back and looking at those definitions. And then in the future, if you see a word like justice or righteousness, to actually go and use your Strong's Concordance and see exactly which Hebrew word that is, because it might change your understanding of it a little bit. Okay, so last night we looked at Deuteronomy 12, and it has to do with destroying idols and even erasing their names anywhere they would appear in the land of Israel. It pointed out even though they were being released pretty much from the cloud to go into the land with this new freedom, yes, they could slaughter animals for meat in all their dwellings as long as they did a kosher slaughter. However, with that freedom, the caution was, you know what, you're going to be doing whatever's right in your own eyes, because there's still a resting place for you. That resting place would be Jerusalem, where people would bring their sacrifices, their tithes, their vows, and so forth to that one central location. But the jeopardy of freedom is ultimately everyone does what is right in his own eyes. And that's a very fine line between just scattergun Torah observance and outright rebellion. So I don't think it's any accident that he juxtaposed the practices of idolatry with how they are to prepare for that resting place that would be called Jerusalem, that central place of worship, and what they're going to have to deal with in between the instatement of the temple in Jerusalem and just the total chaos that can come about when everyone does what's right in his own eyes. Okay, now we are to today's lesson, which is Babylon burning. We want to go through again what does this Torah portion have to do with the book of Revelation? What does this Torah portion have to do with Babylon when Babylon didn't even exist yet? Well, it's prophesying of this system called Babylon. And what I said last night to the classes in the Torah portion, it looks like a bunch of disconnected ideas and laws and warnings and so forth, but they're not disconnected at all. They're all part of the same whole. And you almost have to break it down topic by topic and then pull the lens out and see how all those different topics do fit together. But again, what's going on here is that the people are going to be put in jeopardy for a few hundred years here. I think maybe it's more than that. But there's going to be an interim between the time that Joshua leads them into the land and everybody is doing what's right. And then after Joshua passes away, they're going to enter into a chaos of good judge, bad judge, good judge, bad judge, and so forth. Everyone doing what's right in their own eyes, because even though they'll have the Mishkan, there will still be a kind of a chaos as they wait for the establishment of the temple in Jerusalem. They're still in a step-by-step learning stage, if you think about it, because they're learning how to deal with their freedom. They've been released from the cloud where Moses would tell them every step. Joshua is going to pass away, who would teach them what to do at every step. And now there's not going to be that, great figure standing over the land saying, this is exactly what you do in this situation. Now they're released out to build their homes in their own territories. And it's going to be difficult for them to exercise their righteousness according to the mishpatim, according to the laws that describe the boundaries of their freedom. And so they're going to have to exercise their righteousness, not based on, I feel, I think, I want. It's going to be based on, it is written. And those aren't always the same thing. And so they've got this new freedom, but freedom itself can become an idol that ends up fracturing a people. Freedom only exists within the boundaries of the mishpatim. So the one thing the Torah portion points out is going to be, how do I bring you out of this chaos, out of this diversity of, well, I think the calendar is supposed to look like this. Oh, no, I think this is the way that we set the calendar. Oh, no, I think this is what we do when we can't see the new moon. Oh, no, this is, it takes all that and says, you know what, eventually you're going to have to fit together as a people. And the way that this is going to happen is there will be a temple established. There will be a place where he will put his name. And this is where you're going to celebrate the Moedim. It's going to be a calendar that unifies you and brings you all to the same place at the same time. It's going to unify the kingdom. And by doing that, it's going to be possible to defeat the king of Babylon. And remember, this spirit of Babylon existed even before there was a Babylon. Remember, it was Egypt, the Pharaoh of Egypt, who passed it off to Babylon. The dragon of the Nile passed it off to the first beast kingdom of Babylon. And if you need to go back and review that, feel free. I have to go back and review it too. And so here's the vital scripture that if you've done workbook 1, this is very familiar to you, but it is a taunt against the king of Babylon. And it's Isaiah 14:3 and 4. And then I skip down to verses 12 and 15 to get to the meat of what we're going after here. It says, and it will be on the day when the Lord gives you rest from your hardship. Now remember, back here, he warned them, for you have not as yet come to the resting place. The Moedim, can they be observed with the Mishkan only? Sure, they did it for 40 years in the wilderness, but yet there were some things that weren't done in the wilderness with the Mishkan. For instance, they stopped circumcising. There were certain things that they didn't observe completely in the wilderness with the Mishkan, because they were waiting for the resting place where they would no longer be wandering. That would come with the place where he puts his name. And that, of course, is going to be Jerusalem, the seat of the Moedim. This is what's going to finally solidify you as a nation. So it says, it's going to be on the day when the Lord gives you rest from your hardship. There's a hardship with being in exile, for sure. And there is a hardship to have the land and the boundaries of the land, and yet not to have that place built where he has put his name in Jerusalem, to be prevented from gathering at the Moedim at that particular place. So when he gives you rest from your hardship, your turmoil, and from your harsh service in which you have been enslaved, that you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon and say, Israel will do this once we enter into our rest. Once the temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem, when once again the 12 gates of the city are open, when once again Israel is worshiping at the feasts in Jerusalem, he says at that time, you're going to take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, because here's what the king of Babylon has been doing. It says, how you have fallen from heaven, you star of the morning, son of the dawn. See how he was seeking to displace Yeshua and salvation from heaven? He says, you have been cut down to the earth, you who defeated the nations. Babylon has always wanted to prevail over the nations from the heavenlies. Now, the beast mindset is to defeat the nations and rule over them from the earth. But the Babylonian mindset, the head of the golden image, it's at the top. He says, I want to stick all the way up into the heavenlies, basically to displace Yeshua, who is the star of the morning star, the son of the dawn. Here's what the king of Babylon said in his heart. I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, right? Even above the 12 tribes of Israel, perhaps even above those powers and principalities that were appointed to rule over the 70 nations of the earth. And he says, and I will sit on the mount of the assembly. In Hebrew, that is the mount of the Moed. The mount of the Moed. It's Jerusalem. It's the Temple Mount. It's the place where the Moedim are supposed to be celebrated. He says, I will sit on the mount of the assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. All right, remember who traveled in the clouds of glory? Israel traveled in the clouds of glory. Who is going to return in the cloud? Yeshua is going to return in the cloud. And so the king of Babylon's mindset is to displace heaven itself as the authority over the earth. And it says, nevertheless, you will be brought down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. So what does the king of Babylon consistently do in order to fulfill this wish of his heart? He defeats the nation by sitting on the Mount of the Moed, by destroying their understanding of the biblical calendar. He destroys their, and a lot of this is through anti-Semitism. He wishes to destroy the people who could even teach the nation these things, because he wants to raise his throne above the stars of God. But nevertheless, this is his end. He will be brought down. And so Babylon will continue to pop up because it's a mindset that says, I can control the nations if I can control their feasts. I can control the nations if I can control their calendar. I can control the nations if I can control their holidays. If I can do that, and I might do it through religion, I might do it through secular government, I might even do it through a healthcare system. All of these things can be used in order to leverage that. But if we continue reading in Isaiah 21:9, he addresses Babylon with a statement we're going to hear again in Revelation. He says, now behold, here comes a troop of riders, horsemen in pairs. And one said, fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the images of her gods are shattered on the ground. All the images of her gods are shattered on the ground. That's in our Torah portion. When you come across the images of foreign gods, you are to absolutely smash, shatter, burn them, whatever it takes to destroy those images. And so in this context, we have fallen, fallen is Babylon. The image of the beast is going to begin with the golden head of Babylon. But then he makes a strange statement, horsemen in pairs. Well, now we know of 4 horsemen in the book of Revelation, but how do they ride out in pairs or in twos? Just like this. You'll remember this. See, when the white horse rides out, he's not just in the first place, he's also in the 7th place. With the red horse, he's in the 2nd place, but he's also in the 6th place. With the black horse, he's in the 3rd place, but he's also in the 5th place. And they'll run in cycles and circles, just like you can see with the full menorah there. Now the pale horse, the death horse, remember, this is the one that basically folds on itself in the chiasm. And so what's happening with the white horse, the red horse and the black horse, all of those things come out of the pale horse. That's how they come out in pairs. And so as these 4 horsemen ride out in the book of Revelation, what you have to remember is, okay, this white horse came out with the first seal, but the white horse will also continue on that track with the 7th seal. When the red horse comes out with the 2nd seal, that horse will continue on his route through the 6th seal. When the black horse comes out with the 3rd seal, his route will continue around the 5th seal. And when you see the pale horse with the 4th seal, that's where you go back to that chiasm, where it's going to fold onto itself. So just as a review, I've got the image of the beast here to refresh your memory of how Nebuchadnezzar saw himself as the king of Babylon, the golden head. But if we go all the way down to the feet, it's the feet of the beast that are firmly planted on earth. Remember, the king of Babylon, his heart's desire was to extend his rule into heaven. As the beast kingdoms descend from the golden head, from Babylon to Persia, Media, to Greece, down to Rome, and then now to a mixture of Rome's daughters, represented by the mixed iron and clay feet, you can see that they are more concerned with earthly domination. In fact, that seems to be the theme of the day, being everything is green, it's earth friendly, preserve the earth, kill the people, preserve the earth. It's very earth based. So we can see the golden head of Babylon, I want to rule the heavenlies. And then at the very bottom of the image, we have the iron kingdom of Rome, or descended. These will be offshoots of Rome, organized systems that, what's the word I'm looking for, that branched out, that extended out of the Roman Empire. And in fact, almost any organized system, you're going to see the threads going back to these beast kingdoms, because each beast kingdom just passed on something of itself to the next one. The same way that the Pharaoh, that the dragon, passed his authority on to Nebuchadnezzar, onto the golden head of the beast. So we've got the golden head of Babylon trying to stick his head up into the heavenlies. And we know that that golden head was given authority by the serpent, by Egypt. And so he's fighting in the heavenlies. We see the serpent fighting in the heavenlies. But there will come a point where scripture says he will be thrown down. He'll be thrown down to earth. And then it's like, woe to those who live on the earth, because up to this point, there's been some distraction, perhaps fighting with those principalities and powers of the 70 nations. Perhaps there's other principalities and powers we're not aware of, that the fight is ongoing. But he's going to be thrown down. And in that fall, what will ultimately go with him is his idolatry, his deceits, and his sorceries that he's passed on to the beast. So in Revelation, you see exactly this coalition. You see the serpent giving the beast his authority. They hit it hard because they know they've only got a short time to continue deceiving mankind. Those days are going to be shortened. So they know the time is short. So Deuteronomy 13:6, it says, if your brother, your mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend who is like your own soul, entices you secretly, saying, let's go and serve other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have known, of the gods of the peoples who are around you, near you, or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other end. See, isn't that a strange statement to stick in there? From one end of the earth to the other end. It's creating an open-ended prophecy that will be easier for us to apprehend in the book of Revelation. He says, you shall not consent to him or listen to him, and your eye shall not pity him, nor shall you spare or conceal him. In other words, don't think yourself more merciful than the God who made him. Instead, you shall most certainly kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So you shall stone him to death, because he has attempted to drive you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. Then all Israel will hear about it and be afraid, and will not do such a wicked thing among you again. It sounds harsh, but he's saying, look, I brought you out of the serpent's house when I brought you out of Egypt. Why in the world would you lend an ear to someone who's telling you to go and serve these other gods, lowercase g, principalities and powers? He's saying, look, I brought you out of Egypt. You don't know these gods. You don't know these principalities and powers. I set them over the 70 nations. And so when I brought you out of Egypt, I brought you away from the serpent. There was no way you should have had any interaction with any of these 70 princes of the air. But if somebody comes to you and tells you to serve a god, or come, learn about this God that is not a god at all, he's simply an appointed being over a territory. He has no authority other than the authority that's been given to him. And he's saying, I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you out to reinstate you, to bring you back to plan A, where the 12 tribes would judge from the 12 gates of Jerusalem. So there would be no more need for these 70 principalities and powers of the air to rule the nations, because now you would begin to judge according to the mishpatim, the righteous judgments. That was plan A. And so when you go back and you try to serve these other gods who are created beings, then you're turning the clock back. You're disrupting the plan. So he says, don't put up with that. And then he goes on, and this is going to be long. Again, and we're going to read a long passage in Revelation, but you're going to start to see the parallels. Deuteronomy 13:12, if you hear in one of your cities, which the Lord your God is giving you to live in, anyone saying that some worthless men have gone out from among you and have seduced the inhabitants of their city. Seduction. Remember that it's a seduction, because remember, idolatry is adultery. That's why it's associated with sexual immorality, and why sexual immorality is so horrible in Scripture, because it's the equivalent of idolatry. If somebody comes in and seduces the inhabitants of this city, saying, let's go and serve other gods, whom you have not known, first, you shall investigate. You shall search out. You shall inquire thoroughly. There shall be an investigation. You're going to hold court. And if it is true, and the matter is certain, that this abomination has been committed among you. He calls it an abomination. We're going to look for that in Revelation. You shall most certainly strike the inhabitants of that city with the edge of the sword, utterly destroy it, and all who are in it, and its cattle with the edge of the sword. Then you shall gather all its plunder into the middle of its public square, and burn the city and all its plunder with fire, as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God, and it shall be a ruin forever. It shall never be rebuilt. Nothing at all from what is designated for destruction is to cling to your hand, in order that the Lord may turn from his burning anger and show mercy to you, and have compassion on you, and make you increase, just as he has sworn to your fathers. Remember, last night we talked about the fathers and the resurrection. He says, if you will listen to the voice of the Lord your God, keeping all his commandments, which I am commanding you today, and doing what is right in the sight of the Lord your God. Now we know the characteristic of the tzaddikim, or the saints in Revelation, is that they keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Yeshua. So it has a context. Keeping all his commandments, doing what is right in the sight of the Lord your God, doing righteousness, being that extension of his throne of mercy, as well as his throne of mishpatim, or justice, judgment. So this is the prescription. Should someone seduce the inhabitants of a city into idolatry? And remember, back here, he puts in here, gods of the peoples who are around you, near you, or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other end. Okay, now we're going to break this down, and this is pretty much the heart of the lesson, breaking down these verses from Deuteronomy 12 and 13. Jewish scholars have broken them down point by point, bullet by bullet. There's actually more than this, but this is, I think, a great summary. And it has to do with, what do we do if we have a false prophet, if we have an insider to idolatry, if an entire city has been given over to idolatry, what do we do? And so we're going to match these to some passages in Revelation or the Gospels. And we already know they concern the destruction of Babylon and Edom. But now we're going to read it out of the original prophecy itself, or we did just read it out of the original prophecy itself from Deuteronomy 12 and 13. So step one, if you hear that someone has been seducing to idolatry, if you hear that there is a false prophet, if you hear that an entire city has fallen into idolatry, first you investigate, and then there has to be a judgment. That means there has to be appointed judges and an appointed court system. It has to be done in an organized way, right? Next, if there's a false prophet, he has to be destroyed. If there are idols, they have to be destroyed. If there are deceivers and insiders to idolatry, they have to be destroyed. How is this done? Well, for false prophets and people who incited their brothers to idol worship, that execution is by stoning. If there are men and women and even children, and that sounds harsh, but last night we looked at, are we more merciful than the Holy One? That's the question sometimes, because it's very difficult for us to hear about children even being put to death. But if there were men and women and children found guilty of idol worship, within the land of Israel now. It wasn't their job to go out to the nations and do this, because as we see in the book of Revelation, the Holy One himself makes that trip out through the nations to accomplish this. The pattern is in the land of Israel, but it's according to that pattern, eventually the world will also be judged. So if they're found guilty of idol worship, the most merciful thing that could happen to them is they be put to death by the sword. Any belongings that an idolater had to be burned, even if, and this is interesting, they say, even if they're being stored in a different city. I would have never thought to ask this question, but this is in the Midrash. Let's say you put an idolater to death and you burn all the belongings in his house. But what if this idolater has an offshore account in the Caribbean? What if this idolater has an island mansion in the Bahamas? What if he has franchises of stores all around the world? Well, if he's an idolater, then you have to burn every store. You have to liquidate every bank account. You have to burn every mansion on every island. You have to, basically anywhere that he is invested, it will disappear. It will be destroyed. That's why I say, don't put too much stock in your retirement accounts. If all this starts coming down, it may be that those things that have been invested in by idolaters, those funds simply disappear without accounting. And if you're in mutual funds, then you are going to be mutually affected. And say, well, how do I get out of that? I don't even know. We're too entangled in Babylon to completely disengage in the physical realm. What we have to do is disengage in the spiritual realm. We have to come out of her that way. But there is no refuge in a worldwide economy. It was really interesting that the passage we said, even if it's a faraway place, this is going to be an effect. So there's no refuge in diversifying in a worldwide economy if you are an idolater, because it will still be destroyed no matter where it is. So there's no refuge in a foreign branch, a foreign account. None of that's going to help. If in the investigation it's found that those in this infested city did not serve idols, they'll go free. But their possessions are burned. And the rationale for that is, since they chose to live in a wicked society for material reasons, they lose their belongings. And that's something we could probably talk about for 2 hours. We won't have time to do that today. But what does it mean for people who chose to live in Babylon for material reasons? I think this might be the test. There came a time when the Jews could leave Babylon and go back to their land. Some stayed in Babylon for material reasons. They had such good businesses there. The economy was so good there. It was so comfortable there. There were, you might say, colleges and universities in modern terms. There were great places to shop, great physicians. Everything that could be offered was right there in Babylon. It was still a great city and still a great empire. And so they chose not to come back because they knew there would be hardship if they went back to the land. I think these are the types of people that it's talking about, since they chose to hang on, like Lot. He chose to hang on for material reasons. And if that's why you chose to hang on, then you can escape. And is it in Peter or is it in Hebrews where it talks about people who will be saved, though as for that, it will be by fire. Like they're getting singed on the way out. They're going to lose all their belongings if that was their reason for staying. The city's buildings are burned to the ground. The buildings of that city may never be reconstructed. It's laid waste forever. And no Israelite can attempt to remove or possess any object that is designated for burning. These items are called cherem. They're forbidden objects from which no Israelite may benefit. And I don't think I actually got down to this bullet point in terms of pulling up scriptures, because I knew I had a bunch already, but this might be one you can look for. It says, lest one fear a decrease in population, the Almighty encourages, I will increase you. I will compensate you with tzaddikim, or righteous ones, in exchange for the reshaim, or the wicked, that you executed. So I think the implication here is that in the millennial reign, even though many reshaim, or wicked people, have been executed by divine judgment, nevertheless, the tzaddikim, the righteous ones, will flourish in the reign of Messiah Yeshua. And then this is followed again by the rules of mourning, rules of tithing. And the tithing goes with the feast, by the way. We can't read about tithing without also thinking about the 3 pilgrimages feasts of Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot. So mourning and tithing are part of this as well. So let's kind of break it down little by little. Stoning those who incite to idolatry, or those who turn out to be false prophets. Let's look at Revelation 6:14. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, and the eminent people, and the commanders, and the wealthy, and the strong, and every slave and every free person hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the sight of him who sits on the throne. You see, this is not a local investigation. This is an investigation and court decree that comes straight from the heavenly throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. It says, for the day of their wrath, the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Now, in case you didn't know this, in biblical times, we think about stoning as like everybody picks up a rock and throws it until the person is dead. It could be that way, but one of the more common methods is you push the person off a cliff. Like you take them up to a mountain, to a high place, you push them off the cliff onto the rocks, which is how the Yom Kippur scapegoat was killed. And then you go back and you look, you go down, you check the person, if they're still alive, then you could, as long as you kill him with a rock, you could put a heavy rock on him and put increasing weight on it until he just couldn't breathe anymore. You could go ahead again and pile the rocks on him, as long as it was death by rock. So it's not like you saw in high school when you watched the lottery. It was basically being pushed off a cliff. And if you remember in the Gospels, there was once that they tried to push Yeshua off a cliff. And then it says he just walked through the midst of them and they couldn't see him. But that's what they were really trying to do, is they were trying to stone him by pushing him off the cliff. And then they would have gone down, is he still alive or not? If he's still alive, they follow up and complete it, but they shouldn't survive the trip down as they fall on the rocks. We see exactly this in Revelation, that instead of the judge having to have them stoned, they're trying to stone themselves. They're begging the mountains, fall on us. They're going to the mountains for their own execution. So let's go to Revelation 14. This is really pivotal, and this passage, pretty much 13 and 14, I think, are going to parallel what we just read in our Torah portion. So here's what it says. And I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to preach to those who live on the earth and to every nation, tribe, language, and people. And he said with a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heaven and the earth and sea and springs of waters. It almost sounds as though, even though the disciples were to take the gospel into all the world, that there's going to be one last call before the door of the ark closes, so to speak. And he speaks it to everybody who lives on earth. And he says, last chance, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. And whatever you've been worshiping, you need to stop. And you need to worship him who made the heaven. If you're associated with Babylon, wanting to stick your golden head up into the heavens and be God, no, worship the one who made the heavens. Are you wanting to dominate the earth? Are you part of some system that gives you a sense of power here on earth? No, worship the one who made the earth, even the iron feet and clay of the beast. Worship the one who made the earth, the sea, and the springs of waters. The sea represents the peoples. And so what is he saying here? Nations, this is the last call. And it's one thing to be doing good. Let's say you're trying to green the earth. Great idea. But is this doctrine that you're proclaiming and living by? And we all have our favorite thing. We all have our cause, as long as it is within the boundaries of the mishpatim. If you're understanding the light and heavy of scripture, the life in the scripture, he's saying, have you come to worship the ecosystem more than the one who made the ecosystem? And the answer would have to be yes in a lot of cases. Have you come to worship charity to the poor more than the one who created the poor? You're being asked to weigh that out. And if you can't come out of that, it says another angel, a second one followed, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. He's saying, if you're worshiping anything on heaven, on earth, or in the sea, and you have put that ahead of the Holy One, I'm telling you right now, Babylon the Great has already fallen. Maybe it doesn't feel like it yet to you, but soon it will. And then another angel, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast in his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he will also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. Remember what we said about the rest that was promised to Abraham, his descendants, the rest of a land elevated, the rest of the resurrection. And he says, they have no rest day and night. They have no resurrection. They have no inheritance in this eternal land. They have no rest day and night, those who worship the beast in his image. And whoever receives the mark of his name. Remember, we just were told in this Torah portion about Jerusalem. He says, the place where I will put my name, that's where you're supposed to go worship. If you're worshiping in any other place, if you are worshiping in any way other than the method prescribed, then it just seems by extension, you have received the mark of the beast's name, because you have chosen to worship someone or something other than the one who created the thing you're worshiping. It says, here is the perseverance of the saints, the tzaddikim. That's why we studied righteousness last night, tzedakah, charity to the poor. Here is the perseverance of the tzaddikim who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, so that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them. Okay, sometimes knowing how to read a passage is knowing where the emphasis needs to be. The implication here is that tzaddikim, the righteous, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Yeshua, your deeds are going to follow you. They're going to trail after you whether you like it or not. Your deeds will follow you. What is he talking about here? We want to unpack that. So if you don't remember anything else from this Torah portion, I think this slide right here sums it up. Because often, like I said last night, we look at wicked people who make great contributions to charity. They do great acts of righteousness, but it's not truly charity. It's not truly tzedakah for him. You understand what tzedakah is for. It's to give glory. Where'd that angel go? Right here. Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. What's going to be judged? These acts of tzedakah that you did they give glory to him? And if they gave glory to him, then it is righteousness for you. You're not mistaking your righteousness for his righteousness. Your righteousness can only be the righteousness of his glory that is reflected in you. So for a true tzaddik, a truly righteous person, it says the commandments are righteousness for you. And so Moses gives an example of this in Deuteronomy 24:13. This is the kind of tzedakah that you want to do. It says, when the sun goes down, you shall certainly return the pledge to him. Somebody that's given you something in pledge for a loan. And again, it has to do with your relationship to the poor, which is in this Torah portion. It has to do with the tithes and so forth, because part of your tithe goes to the poor. He says you have to return that pledge to him so that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it will be righteousness for you before the Lord your God, on your behalf, because your instinct is, hey, look, this coat you gave me, it's only good till sundown. I need my money back. And he doesn't have the money. And you say, you know what? I know you don't have the money, but here's your coat. Stay warm tonight. And he says, if you have that attitude about the mishpatim, he says, this will be righteousness for you because you're lending to Adonai and he will repay. If you lend to the poor, he will repay. So he's saying this particular deed of tzedakah, this particular act of righteousness, that's the kind of deed that will follow you into the kingdom. When a wicked person does tzedakah, he's only doing good in this life, and he's going to be rewarded in this life. And he's deceived into thinking he is good. In fact, he thinks he's better than God because he's taking care of God's people better than God is. God let him be poor, and look, I went and I helped him. So I'm a better person than God is. And that's not the way that it is at all. He might even seem to prosper in it. He might give away millions and billions of dollars to great charities, do great tzedakah, but he's deceived into thinking he's a good person. That's a sorcery. It's an illusion. It's an illusion of goodness because there is no one good but Elohim. So any good deed done in another name is not true tzedakah. It's just dedicated to another God. which is you. You become the God. So when we take true grace and tzedakah, it has to be paired with obedience to judgment and truth. Anything else is just idol worship. It's self-worship. And you're making yourself out to be more merciful than God. Now, does that mean that the good that they do, like when they feed the hungry, when they send them clothes, when they give them farming implements and give them goats and chickens and whatever these charities do for people, recovery centers, are we saying those are bad things? No, absolutely not. It's still good to the recipient. It's still doing good for the recipient. And even that wicked person will be repaid. The difference is the wicked person is repaid for that in this life. That deed cannot follow after him. It doesn't penetrate into that place of rest. That's why it seems the wicked prosper. It seems like, well, they always have plenty. Well, they always have plenty because they're being paid off. And then once they die, it's like debt paid in full. You did some good. I did you some good back. But now you're entering into eternity, and what has come with you? What has followed after you? Well, if it was only for your own sense of self-righteousness, then nothing. But for those who did good, for the sake of the Holy One and for his glory, those are the deeds. That's righteousness for you in the world to come. And so what would you rather have? A lot of wealth for 70 or 80 years? Or would you rather be wealthy forever? That's the difference. So back to our investigation here. After an investigation and a judgment for the charge of idolatry, the guilty are put to death by the sword. Those who did not worship idols will go free, but they will lose every possession to the fire. Now let's go back to Revelation 18. It says, after these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated from his glory. Okay, he has great authority. This goes back to the judgment. He cried out with a mighty voice, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Well, we heard that in Isaiah. We knew when we heard fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, that horses were about to start riding out. She's become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have fallen because of the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And the kings of the earth have committed acts of sexual immorality with her. Right there is the seduction of the idolater. The idolater comes into a city and seduces the city. Right here, we can see that Babylon is the seductress with the kings of the earth who will commit sexual immorality, which is idolatry, with her. And hooked into that, along with that, perhaps the vehicle for that is the economy. He says the merchants of the earth have become rich from the excessive wealth of her luxury. And you say, well, is it just the economy? No, because that's how governments have become rich. That's how governments have become stronger. That's how all these sucking systems work with the economy. It says, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive any of her plagues. For her sins have piled up as high as heaven. Remember, Babylon wanted to rule heaven, and God has remembered her offenses. Pay her back, even as she has been paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mixed twice as much for her, to the extent that she glorified herself. See, our verses says, no, the glory The warning is give glory to Adonai, give glory to the one who created the heavens and the earth and the seas and all that's in them. Okay, if you didn't do that, to the extent that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, to the same extent, give to her torment and mourning. Remember in our Torah portion, it follows up with the rules of mourning. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I am not a widow, and will never see mourning. For this reason, in one day, her plagues will come, plague and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for the Lord who judges her is strong. So what was our context in the original prophecy? That worthless men will go out and they will try to seduce you into idolatry. And if you don't deal with them, and dealing with them is the most merciful thing you can do, then he says, I will be coming eventually. And the seductress will be burned with fire. The worthless men who have drawn you in to idolatry, they will be burned with fire. It says, for the Lord who judges her is strong. And the kings of the earth who committed acts of sexual immorality and lived luxuriously with her will weep and mourn over her when they see the smoke of her burning. Standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, woe, woe, the great city, Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. That is exactly what our Torah portion is about. You investigate, you make a judgment, and then you start burning. You burn that city to the ground. Every building, every possession, everything that was given over to idolatry. And then we went, well, why would it follow up and talk about mourning? Well, because it's part of this. We can see it more vividly in Revelation, why these prophecies would be stacked like they are in the Torah portion. And the thing is, remember, and he says, even if it's afar off, even if these gods are coming from afar off, it's leaving open-ended this judgment on the entire world for idolatry. And in fact, where it says in 1 day her plagues will come, plague and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire. Just remember too, a day doesn't have to be a literal 24-hour day. It can be an appointed time period for a certain thing to happen, like in that day, okay? But it could be that all of these are activated at exactly the same time. So let's continue. This is long, and like I say, you want to go back and you want to pick this apart on your own time much more closely. The merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her. See, not just in one place, not just in literal Babylon, but the merchants of the earth. Babylon extends around the earth. Weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple silk, scarlet, every kind of citron wood, ivory, every article made from very valuable wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, perfume, frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, cargo of horses, carriages, slaves, and human lives. All of these things, the fruit you long for has left you. And all things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you. And people will no longer find them. Remember what it says, you can never rebuild that city. Everything has to be completely burned up. You can't find them anymore. Remember, you can't go in there and rescue something. Say, oh, that looks like it could be valuable. That won't hurt anything if I keep that. Yes, it will. He said, don't touch that. Once I start the burning, don't try to rush in there and save something. It should no longer be found. The merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand at a distance because of the fear of her torment, weeping and mourning. There's our mourning again, saying, woe, woe, the great city, she who was clothed in fine linen, purple, scarlet, adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. For in 1 hour, such great wealth has been laid waste. It's like an instantaneous burning. And in an hour, it's going to burn all of that up. Every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor and all who make their living by the sea. Remember, the sea, it represents the nations, stood at a distance, and they were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what city is like the great city? They threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, woe, woe. The great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich from her prosperity. For in 1 hour she's been laid waste. This is the judgment on an idolatrous city. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. Right? So we've looked many times at those souls crying out under the altar. The saints who said, how long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood on the earth? These systems were truly the source of our oppression, these systems of Babylon. It says, then a strong angel picked up a stone, like a great millstone. Talk about a stoning. He threw it into the sea. He threw it into the nations, saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence. She will never be found again. Remember, it can never be rebuilt. The sound of harpists, musicians, flute players, and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. And no craftsman of any craft will ever be found in you again. And the sound of a mill will never be heard in you again. And the light of a lamp will never shine in you again. And the voice of the groom and the bride will never be heard in you again. Okay, it's just reiterating what we know about a banned city, a city under the destruction. Never again. For your merchants were the powerful people of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your witchcraft. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints and of all who have been slaughtered on the earth. So when we look at all the systems of Babylon, the beast, all those good things that came out of the Babylonian system were used to elevate the beast over the nations. And at the same time, to try to kill and subdue the true prophets and the tzaddikim of the Most High. And because she is a seductress, that goes back to our Torah portion. She's a seductress. She'll try to go in and say, oh, come over here. Come over here. Look at what this offers you. Look at what that offers you. It's a merchandising. She's peddling idolatry. And she'll use any system she possibly can to seduce you into idolatry. It might be through goods and services, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. It can also be through unequal unions, the sound of the mill. It can just be a food supply. What will you do for food? It might be through music. That might be the seduction through which she introduces ideas that you never learned in scripture. And so it's the soul that is lured in by Babylon. It's what you think. It's what you want. It's what you think you need. It's your appetite, emotion, your desire, and your intellect. And when you don't subdue those with the power of the Holy Spirit, then you are vulnerable to Babylon and that seduction. Isaiah 57, 1-5 says, the righteous person perishes, and no one takes it to heart. And devout people are taken away while no one understands. For the righteous person is taken away from evil. He enters into peace. They rest in their beds, each one who walked in his upright way. Right? So remember, your deeds follow after you. If you're a righteous person, you're in peace. You've entered into that rest. He says, you've not yet achieved the rest that you will, but they will rest even until the resurrection. But he says, come here, you sons of a sorceress, offspring of an adulterer and a prostitute. Of whom do you make fun? Remember, the taunt is going to be against the king of Babylon. He says, of whom do you make fun? Against whom do you open wide your mouth and stick out your tongue? Are you not children of rebellion, offspring of deceit, who inflame yourselves among the oaks under every luxuriant tree, who slaughter the children in the ravines under the clefts of the rocks? See the contrast there in Isaiah? It's all going to be flipped over. You know, talk about Yeshua turning over the money changers' tables. There is coming a divine judgment where everything is flipped over. And those who taunt and rebel, what are they going to taunt about? And what are they going to rebel against? They used their freedom. They used their free will as a rebellion. Now about the sword, remember putting the certain people to the sword. Well, Revelation is full of the sword. And so I just, on the slide here, I list, what was it? 9 passages out of the book of Revelation about how people are to be killed with the sword. And then, again, it goes back even to the red horse. His rider is carrying a large sword. Yeshua is carrying a sharp 2-edged sword. Death has a sword. And then in 1921, it kind of sums it up. It says, the rest were killed with the sword, which came from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. And here's what Yeshua says about the sword. He says, do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to turn a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a person's enemies will be the members of his own household. The one who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And the one who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And the one who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. The one who has found his life will lose it. And the one who has lost his life on my account will find it. Right. Now, this doesn't mean that just, oh, I've come to understand Torah, and now my whole family is my enemy. That's not what he's saying. The context is back here in the Torah portion, where he says, even if a member of your own family comes and tries to seduce you, then you're going to have to deal with that person. You're going to have to try to bring that person to repentance first before it turns into a full-fledged investigation. And so when members of our own household try to seduce us into sin, they become your enemy. Just like, remember, in one breath, Peter says, oh, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of the living God. And Yeshua says, oh, blessed are you, Shimon bar Yonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And then when Yeshua starts talking about dying, Peter says, oh, no, Lord, it can't be that you would die. And Yeshua turns. The same person who he just called blessed, he says, get behind me, Satan. Now you're my enemy. Right? It didn't instantly mean that Peter went to hell. It meant that Peter needed to repent in trying to find an easier way through the plan. And often the members of our own family are trying to find the easier way through the plan. And they will try to seduce you into following that easier way through the plan. When Yeshua says, nope, you're going to have to take up your cross, just like me. There's no easy way through this. But he says, the one who receives you receives me. And the one who receives me receives him who sent me. The one who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And the one who receives a righteous person in the name of a righteous person shall receive a righteous person's reward. And whoever gives one of these little ones just a cup of cold water to drink in the name of a disciple, truly I say to you, he shall by no means lose his reward. He's saying we're all together. This is your family. The righteous, the tzaddikim, this is your family. And so what about the sword? Yeshua is teaching you one application, like, oh my goodness, what if members of my own family are trying to seduce me? I think Yeshua is telling you, don't love them so much that they seduce you into sin. Don't love them so much that you follow them into Babylon. Because you want to maintain your strength, take up your cross. That's how you're going to find your life, by losing it, because the day may come when you will have to say, follow me. I know the way out of this burning city. Just follow me. You're not going to be able to take anything with you, but I know the way out. Again, no idolater's merchandise is safe, even if it's stored in a faraway location. We saw that in the passage in Revelation, for in 1 hour, such great wealth has been laid waste. Every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor, all who make their living by the sea, stood at a distance and were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what city is like the great city? Doesn't matter how far away you store your wealth, it's not safe. If it's gained through idolatry or as a vehicle of idolatry. The portion said, destroy the false prophets. Those in the city who did not serve idols, they will go free, but their possessions are burned. And that's because they chose to live in a place of wickedness strictly for material reasons. So they're going to lose those belongings. And they cannot attempt to remove any of those belongings with them, because remember, those deeds can't follow after them. They weren't righteousness for them, not by any means. So Matthew 24:15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, and this has occurred several times in history, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever's on the housetop must not go down to get things out of his house. And whoever's in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those women who are pregnant, those who are nursing babies in those days. Moreover, pray that when you flee, it will not be in the winter on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will again. And if those days had not been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or he's over here, don't believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will provide great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I've told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If he's in the inner rooms, don't believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. So Yeshua is kind of reviewing this Torah portion. The question, what do we do if we have a false prophet? Well, you investigate, you judge. And the rabbis comment on this extensively. It doesn't matter if he's doing great signs and wonders. If he's leading you away from the written word, then he's false, no matter how great a sign and how great a wonder. And then again, he's reiterating, look, you know, you're living in a Babylonian society. When you start to see the burning, get off your housetop, leave the field, and don't go back to the house to try to get something out of the house. You're not going to be able to take anything out of there. The only thing you're going to be able to take with you is the righteousness that you have done for the glory of Adonai. Then the portion starts talking about, wow, I wondered why it seemed like this was going on forever, and it is. I didn't have my alarm set. Let's see if we can't wrap this up pretty fast. It goes on and discusses tithes. You've got the teruma, which is at least 1/60th of your crops that you give to the Kohanim. You've got the first tithe, that's a 10th, and you give it to the Levite of your choice. The second tithe, you bring in the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the Shemitah cycle. And you set that apart in order to consume, basically have a party in Jerusalem at the Moedim. That's for you, your household, sons, daughters, and so forth. And then the tithe for the poor, you collect that in the third and the sixth year of the Shemitah cycle. And you bring that instead of the Sheni, the one that you celebrate. You take that money and set it aside to enjoy the feasts in Jerusalem. In the third and the sixth years, you will give this tithe instead of the Sheni, and you'll distribute it to the poor who are permitted to eat it in any location. They don't have to eat it in Jerusalem. Now, these are specifically to the land. Outside of the land, I think we just have to look in general at stinginess. I think that's the quality he's getting at here. But it's believed that when a plague comes into the earth or a famine comes into the earth, it's a direct result of failing to tithe. In other words, you were given this produce and you didn't separate out the tithe of the produce to apportion it to the people who serve the Holy One and you. You didn't apportion it out to the poor. You didn't apportion it out to celebrate the feasts with your family. And when we don't do those things, that's when it's thought that a famine will come, not just on Israel, it'll come into the whole world. And remember, your four altar judgments, they're famine, sword, wild beasts, and plague. You see those in the Torah, you see them in the prophets, you see them again in Revelation. Revelation 6:8 says, I looked and behold an ashen horse, the one who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword. We've talked about that. With the plague, we're enduring that. With the wild animals, and this is not strictly just wild animals. This is also mob behavior, riots, wicked social behavior, in other words. And then the famine. What's the famine for? Because we've not set aside part of our income to celebrate the feasts. We've not supported those who minister on our behalf. Or in this case, the teachers, because the Levites and the Kohanim were the primary teachers, and the poor. We've not opened our hand to those people, and therefore the famine comes. And it also says it in Revelation 18:8. For this reason, in one day her plagues will come, plague and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for the Lord God who judges her is strong. So even though you can't give a literal tithe if you don't live in the land, you can still set aside a portion of your income for these specific purposes. It gives you the purposes. And so again, you've got flexibility. You have much freedom. But I don't think you have freedom completely from the principle it's teaching. Support those who minister on your behalf. Make sure that you have sufficient set aside to celebrate fully, because you're commanded to do it with joy, the Moedim. And if you can do it in Jerusalem, all the better. And then the poor. If you're not supporting the poor, especially those of the faith, if you don't do those things, then that can be part of what Revelation 18:8 is talking about. Plagues, mourning, famine, burning with fire. Because the Lord God who judges her is strong. It suggests that failure to set aside a portion of income for these particular purposes is somehow attached to a vestige of idolatry. Because if it's the idolater who's burned with fire, and then she's saying, okay, you're going to get the famine and the fire, it suggests that these two things are connected. We have the abomination of inciting idolatry, Deuteronomy 7:25 through 26. He says it's an abomination to the Lord. You shall not bring an abomination into your house and become designated for destruction. You were to utterly detest it. You were to loathe it, for it is something designated for destruction. And then Deuteronomy 13:14 says, investigate, search out, inquire thoroughly. If it's true, the matter is certain that this abomination has been committed among you. Now that word there for abomination is to'evah. To'evah, something that's disgusting, especially idolatry. Now let's look at Revelation 17:1 through 5, and everybody's familiar with this. Come here, I'll show you the judgment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of sexual immorality. And those who live on the earth became drunk with the wine of her sexual immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. The scarlet beast, of course, is Edom. He's the legs and the feet of the beast, kingdoms, full of blasphemous names. Right, full of blasphemous names. These are other names, but he says, I want you to worship in this place where I will put my name. Jerusalem is the seat of the Moedim. This is what's going to pull you together as a people and distinguish you from idolaters. Your calendar will actually distinguish you from those who are full of blasphemous names. He says, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman's clothed in purple, scarlet, adorned with gold, precious stones, pearls, holding in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of unclean things of her sexual immorality. On her forehead, a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. Well, what does our Torah portion say? Watch out for worthless men who will seduce the inhabitants of a city, saying, let's go and serve other gods, these abominations. And this should be where we wrap it up. If I remember, I think this is the last slide. Isaiah 25:1 through 4 says, Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will give thanks to your name, not blasphemous names, your name. For you have worked wonders, plans formed long ago with perfect faithfulness. For you have turned a city into a heap, a fortified city into a ruin. A palace of strangers is no longer a city. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore, a strong people will glorify you. Cities of ruthless nations will revere you. For you have been a stronghold for the helpless, a stronghold for the poor in his distress. a refuge from the storm, a shade from the heat. And if you'll remember, this is how the clouds of glory were described, as being the shade from the heat, a protection from enemies all around them, a protection from the serpents and the scorpions below. It was a stronghold and a refuge for them, even in that howling waste of a wilderness. And he's saying all the systems that descended from Babylon, all the way down to the iron and clay feet of Edom, of Rome, those cities are going to be turned into a ruin. They will never be rebuilt. And because we know that, well, not completely because we know that, but it's a great reason to know that it's a strong people who will glorify him instead of these systems. They'll glorify the creator, not the created. And that's really the question, I think, that grows out of this Torah portion as we exercise our freedom in Messiah. Have secular ideas of freedom, have national ideas of freedom, because we live in the United States. We were a nation born out of rebellion. We get that. You know, our tea parties were a little different from those in the UK. So a nation born out of rebellion to earn their freedom is always going to have to guard their hearts, that their freedom to worship one God indivisible with liberty and justice for all, that instead it doesn't become a rebellion where everybody does what's right in their own eyes and descends into a state of chaos, of famine, of wild beasts, of sword and plague. And I think for those of us who know these scriptures, I don't think it's a wake-up call. I think it's more of a, here I am. Generations have wondered about these things. They've learned these things without fully seeing them enacted around the earth. And we are a generation who now, we are able to see every one of these things in one form or another, trace them all the way back to the Torah portion where Revelation started, with burning cities and burning up 1/3 of things and so forth. I know this has been a deep study. I also know because of its depth, it's going to be impossible to answer every question you have, because most likely your questions would take days to answer if we truly investigated them and searched them out. So we're still recording, aren't we? Let me turn this off.